Welcome back to the Elements of Deep Sea Mining. Welcome to the new year, I guess, everyone. This will be the first episode in 2026, and it's a good one to start off with. We're doing News Roundup Part 3 with intrepid deep sea journalist Elyse Hauser, publisher of the Notes from the Deep Substack, amongst freelance pieces in a variety of different publications lately. So, Elyse, thank you for being here.
Yeah, always happy to be here.
And what we're doing again here is that Elyse has put together a list of the main news headlines in deep sea mining since the last time we did this, which was August 2025. So Elyse will take us through what's happened in the last 6 months and what is on the block for upcoming deep sea mining news. Take it away, Elyse.
Yeah, so I think the first major thing after our last roundup was that the metals company, TMC, published two economic studies, an initial assessment of some of their proposed mining areas, and a pre-feasibility study of one mining area which declared probable mineral reserves. And that's the first time mineral reserves have been declared for minerals from the deep sea. And Eric, since you are an expert in the minerals supply chain space, I wonder if you can help explain why mineral reserves matter and what they are.
I'm an expert in very little, but I I am happy to try to distinguish between mineral resources and mineral reserves and explain why reserves are a big deal. Resources are the amount of mineral that we think is in a certain area. And so people have been making assessments of the amount of resources believed to be in various areas of the Clarion-Clipperton Zone for quite a while. And those resource estimates have always been huge in the kind of the global context that there are a lot of minerals down there. And yeah, this is the first time anyone has done an actual reserve estimate. The reserve estimate is how many of those resources can reasonably be expected to be sold at market under certain business assumptions. That's what the pre-feasibility study the metals company released laid out their assumptions and models and plans to get these minerals to market and walked through, given this plan, given all the cost estimates and sale price estimates, how much of that mineral reserve that they've got in their exploration license area do they anticipate being able to actually sell at market?
So it's like these are the minerals that we can expect to be profitable. Is that an accurate synopsis?
That's Yeah, I think that's key because it's not only what minerals are there and can we get them out, but at what price in the market is it worth it to get these minerals out? And so, if notably, if the price of nickel were to go up, then the reserve would generally go up. And if the price of nickel goes down, then the reserve figures go down because the quantity of metal you can expect to get is kind of attached to how much you can sell that for.
Interesting.
And as far as I understand, this is the first time anyone has done this. When the metals company released their pre-feasibility study in August last year, some details were put together by their own analysts, but a lot of them were put together by third-party qualified persons. And it is interesting that this is the first time that anyone has done this kind of resource calculation, reserve calculation for deep sea minerals. So they're kind of using methods from land-based mining and applying it to a new context.
Yeah, and I recall there was some controversy about some TMC people being authors of this, but also I think it's hard to find qualified persons for the deep sea mining space.
There's going to be controversy around everything that the metals company does. Notably, the metals company has released this under SEC. So, like, I guess a key aspect is that the pre-feasibility study is an official document for investors. The metals company is really held to what they say in that document. They can be sued over making misrepresentations because investors are relying on what's in there making investment decisions. And so there are standards and rules around these sorts of declarations. And yeah, in the in some jurisdictions in Canada and I think Australia, you have to have all of your qualified personnel be arm's length from the company. In the United States, they are allowed to have some of their report produced internally,
Mhm.
and the metals company did in this case. And yeah, I guess it wouldn't be easy to find externally qualified people. Anyway, I mean, the metals company does have a lot of has established a lot of the expertise in deep sea mining.
Yeah. Yeah, and there was some criticism, but they didn't break any rules, so that's notable.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also worth reiterating that these plans are for international waters, but under a US permitting scheme. And that is, of course, another source of controversy because many countries believe the International Seabed Authority is in charge of the international seabed, and the US is going rogue in offering these potential permits to the metals company.
Yeah, and has there been any real developments in the last 6 months? This broke in the spring, I guess, when Trump made a executive order back in April, and everybody has become worried about it. And as far as I know, that's just kind of cruising along. Everyone seems to be talking as if the metal company will go ahead under United States jurisdiction for international exploitation.
Yeah, the big development that just happened was that the US announced a streamlined permitting process for international waters. Now companies can apply for an exploration and extraction permit at the same time, and the metals company has already filed for that combined permit. So things do seem to be moving right along.
This rule change had been discussed previously, and NOAA had a comment period on this rule change. This is the implementation of something that's been in the works for at least 6 or 8 months now.
Yeah, the comment period and the proposed rule was last summer, and then just recently, NOAA came out and said, yes, we are definitely combining these permits, giving companies the option to apply for both at once. Clearly, the metals company expected it because they already had their new streamlined application ready to go.
You said they got that the day after the rule change was announced.
Yeah, the day after. So they were expecting, I think, for NOAA to greenlight that change.
And what else is happening under NOAA? They've got an additional application under DSHMRA.
Yeah, there was an application made for only an exploration permit by an apparently new company. I haven't dug into them much yet, but they're called Deep Sea Rare Minerals. They're also looking at the Clarion-Clipperton Zone as well as an area near Guam, but apparently it's still international waters. So it will be interesting as more information comes out.
These guys don't have anything on their. They have a website. There's not really anything about who they are or what they do. More information to be revealed. I don't know if you know about the area off Guam. If it was a new area under the ISA, that would be different because so far the areas that the metals company have applied for are areas they have permits for under the ISA. So they're transferring it to the new administration. I assume this new area outside of Guam is a totally new area that the ISA hadn't been regulating earlier. But yeah, I think that's new. It shows the industry expectations under NOAA are to go beyond just an interim. We're going to keep our current plan until the ISA publishes exploitation regulations. If people are starting to look for new jurisdictions and make new applications that weren't pre-existing, that's interesting.
And I think the US government is willing to do some of the kind of baseline mineral exploration that would help these companies move forward by figuring out where resources are in unexplored areas.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
And then you also had a note about NOAA investigating just outside American Samoa.
that's tied to my point about the US government shouldering some of the exploration burden for companies because Impossible Metals has applied for a license to mine around American Samoa, which is in US waters, but they don't have a robust amount of exploration there yet to characterize mineral deposits and things like that. And so a US agency announcing they're going to map marine minerals around American Samoa helps provide certainty by assisting Impossible Metals with the research that they need.
Okay, but that's still inside the American Samoa exclusive economic zone. So this is NOAA putting its resources behind the areas currently of interest,
Yes.
as far as you
Yeah.
understand. And that's similar to how NOAA is also putting resources into exploration around the Cook Islands.
The Cook Islands is running its own deep sea mining exploration project, but a couple of the companies in the Cook Islands are closely connected to the US or were founded by US people. And the US has historically assisted with researching marine minerals there. So I think, in addition to the US wanting to lead its own deep sea mining program in both national and international waters, it also wants to partner with other countries to get their deep sea mining programs going and maybe access those minerals. And so I think there's a lot of things happening at once, but in the Cook Islands, it's the US assisting another country.
Okay, this headline you've got here, the US sent out research vessel Nautilus. Everyone in deep sea mining seems to name everything Nautilus. I meant to look up where that word comes from because it's popular. But yeah, the US sent the research vessel Nautilus to gather info on Cook Island nodule ecosystems.
Yeah, Nautilus, which is a fairly prominent vessel just doing marine research in general, and I think named for the marine cephalopod, the Nautilus with the really cool shell. So that was sent out on this kind of deep sea mineral expedition, which was science, but with industry application. And I mean, there were some protests about the ship arriving, and I thought it was probably the first time this ship has ever been protested because usually it's just doing marine research without really a clear industry connection. But it was sent out right after the US and the Cook Islands announced a formal seabed mineral cooperation agreement. So it was clearly doing something in support of that agreement to, move deep sea mining toward feasibility.
That's interesting. What's the timescale we're talking here? The US and Cook Islands made a cooperation agreement in the summertime, and then the Nautilus did some exploration in the fall.
Yeah, it
Is that right?
happened really fast, a few weeks, maybe a few months max between the agreement and the research mission starting. So I thought that was interesting because usually research vessels are not prepped and ready to go so quickly. I'm sure there's more to the story on how that happened.
I'm impressed anyone could get anything done in 3 months.
Mhm.
Can barely schedule a meeting in 3 months. Right after Nautilus left, a Chinese research ship also arrived into Cook Islands waters to continue with Chinese-led research. So the Cook Islands continues to have, I was going to say, a hand in two different pots, but two different hands in their pot, I suppose.
Yeah, the Cook Islands and China also has a deep sea mining research cooperation agreement that came before the US agreement. Clearly, that's still alive and well. And so it was almost a bit comedic that right after this US vessel left, a Chinese vessel showed up to do more assistance with helping the Cook Islands research their deep sea environment.
Yeah, good on the Cook Islands for getting support from everybody. And other American DSM news before we go international?
Just stay in the Cook Islands for a moment. The country also made headlines by extending its deep sea mining exploration phase to 2032. So there's already formal exploration, which is the kind of formal precursor to actual full scale deep sea mining happening in the Cooks. But the government said, hey, we think companies need more time to do their research. And so we're going to extend this phase to 2032. It's possible companies might be able to apply for extraction permits before that if they have all their research done, but it was basically just saying, yeah, we're not ready to start this industry just yet, which is a relatively responsible decision.
Reasonable and uncontentious from the coverage I saw. The main company involved didn't seem to have a problem with it. They kind of said, yeah, we're not ready to start applying for exploitation permits yet, so let's just push out this exploration phase longer. It seems like the Cook Islands is doing something well.
Yeah, everyone's going, yeah, we need more time, which is very different from the US situation.
Or the Norwegian situation, which
Mhm.
we'll get to.
Yeah.
Impossible Metals partnered with Bahrain.
Yeah, I realized I should have looked up how to pronounce the name of that country. I know it's in the Middle East and it's small.
I would go with Bahrain.
Rain sounds right. And so Impossible Metals companies have to go through a country to get the permit through the International Seabed Authority. And so there's this partnership happening where Impossible Metals will provide technology and expertise, but Bahrain can access the permits. And we'll see what happens. I haven't heard really anything about that since it was first announced.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that you don't have to be a country with a Pacific coast to apply for an ISA permit to mine in the Pacific Ocean. It
Yeah.
seems like a lot of newsmaking sponsoring states are Pacific Island nations, but you can get a nation anywhere to sponsor you to apply for permits in the Clarion Clipperton Zone.
Yeah, the idea being that these international mineral resources are really the resources of the world, and so everyone should have equal access, which is why the US going in international waters is controversial.
Should we go to Norway then?
Yeah, I always love going to Norway.
I'll come over. The big news in Norway just before Christmas, late November,
Mhm.
was that the Norwegian government halted all deep sea mining exploration until the end of the current government.
I think I saw until 2029, so yeah, that seems right.
Yeah, what do you think about this?
Yeah, a pause is in some way just a pause. Deep sea mining hasn't been happening and will continue to not happen. I imagine the Norwegian companies are not super happy about it, and it's an interesting flip where Norway was this real front runner and poised to be this kind of first country opening for deep sea mining in its waters, and now all of a sudden it's off the map for the time being. But I'm curious, since you're in Norway, if you get a sense of what the conversation has been like around this pause.
Yeah. Yeah, at first I thought they're stopping something that they haven't started. And so my initial reaction was, isn't this more of a just kind of a hollow positioning? But I realized that it's because they've put the halt on exploration, they've really stopped the industry from moving forward. Companies are now at the phase where what they need to do is get out there and collect more information. They need to map and establish and do baseline studies in order to move through what an exploration phase should look like so that there can someday be an exploitation phase. So putting a halt on the opening of an exploration phase is really, yeah, I think it's really quite meaningful. As to why they did it, I can't help but always just feel that so much of the conversation around deep sea mining, especially in Norway, is very messaging oriented. And
Mhm.
so I guess I think two things. I think on the one hand, Norway bungled the way they messaged around deep sea mining when they first started moving towards opening. There was this real feeling that Norway is like driving too hard towards the process, and it made a lot of people worried, and it made a lot of people try to put the brakes on hard, and now people have managed to get the brakes on. And yeah, I guess the other thing to understand is that Norway's government is like there's kind of nine semi-major political parties in Norway. So a government is always a negotiation between some handful of parties that together can make up a majority. So it's very different from Canada or the US where sometimes you get a majority government and it's kind of like a vote happens and somebody comes into office and makes some decisions. In Norway, it's
Mhm.
always a negotiation. And this was just a my opinion is that this topic was controversial enough that some politicians wanted to make a statement by kind of getting it done.
Do you have a sense of whether government-led mapping and research of seabed minerals is going to keep going in that pause?
Yeah, I've seen kind of in both directions that it is going to keep going. For one thing, there are research projects that were funded last year that are, intended to take place this year, and they're not withdrawing funding from those. But they have reduced the amount of funding to their offshore directorates, kind of just directly government sponsored exploration. So it is a little bit of both things.
I've come to think of deep sea mining as having kind of three stages, right? There's full scale exploitation, and then before that, there's exploration, and then before that, there's the kind of pre work of research and mapping the seabed and things like that may or may not eventually lead down a deep sea mining path. So I guess now Norway is
Right.
at that kind of zero stage.
Yeah, they're still working through. I mean, there's mapping. Mapping has been done, um, both by the offshore directorate and but kind of like by the government, by research institutions, and sometimes along with some of the industry actors. But yeah, what they've really done is they've closed the possibility for industry actors to funnel money into getting that exploration done. And it seems like they've turned down the amount of government money going directly into resource mapping.
And then it seems like some of the Norwegian companies are pivoting to International Seabed Authority licenses. Have you heard anything about that?
I should have some conversations with Norwegian companies coming up. When you're a mining company in the exploration phase, before you've got a mineral resource and a path to market and funding, a lot of what you're doing is messaging to get investment. You run your company for the first decade off capital injections in investment injections. And so,
Mhm.
so much of what you see in the responses to this sort of thing is messaging towards investment. So, was a deep sea mining company really going to get going in Norway before 2029? They were, I'm sure, intending to get exploring before 2029. Is this necessarily a showstopper for a Norwegian deep sea mining industry? You can't be moving towards exploitation if you haven't done the exploration. But at the same time, the industry, I get the feeling that people in the industry are always speaking as if their timelines are much shorter. This industry that is a long way off to actually reaching the exploitation phase. So I guess they've got to keep their investors keep saying they've got a path to a reasonably short-term revenue stream. So it makes sense to pivot to international markets. And do think that the Norwegian industry feels quite frustrated. So I'm sure a lot of them are, looking over at what Loke Minerals did, shifting to international markets and kind of getting out of Norway. This is
Mhm.
the kind of comment that I think a lot of them make towards the government, saying, okay, if you don't give us a foreseeable, steady regulatory pathway, then we're going to go elsewhere. And it's pretty reasonable to think that they might.
Yeah, interesting. So we'll keep an eye on what's happening there.
Then, yeah, where do you want to go next?
The next thing on my list is just to talk about the kind of big study that came out late last year looking at how the seabed ecosystem responded to the metals company's biggest deep sea mining test. There was tons of new science last year, and obviously we won't have time to talk about all of it, but I felt like this was maybe the most notable study to talk about. So scientists were going with the metals company when it was doing its big deep sea mining test in, I believe, 2022. And because science is slow, just now some results are coming out. So there were impacts to life at the mining site. The abundance of species decreased by 32% in the directly mined areas, and the total number of animals decreased by 37% in those areas. So, a significant decrease, not a total removal of life in the area where the mining machine actually went. And it's really notable because a lot of the mining test research was done with the equipment and processes used decades ago. This is the first time that we're seeing results of mining at test scale with modern equipment.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think a lot of those tests done years ago weren't even mining tests. They just sent a machine down to churn up the seafloor
Hmm.
and see what happens post disturbance. Having done this with the actual collector vehicle is a new result. When it comes to mining, especially the way the metals company plans to do it, there's the directly impacted area, and then there's the areas impacted by sediments. What did the study show about the areas that were just sedimented upon?
Yeah, so the sediment is landing, it seems, relatively close to the mined area, and the life there actually didn't decrease, but it got a little bit less biodiverse. I don't think the scientists have confirmed why that is, but it seems likely that there's just some species that do better with sediment than others. And the big question now is, will these ecosystems go back to their baseline in the coming years, or are these impacts more permanent?
And then, should we mention Japan?
Yeah, so this is shifting out of wrapping up 2025 and looking ahead into 2026, but Japan is currently, as we speak, apparently pulling deep sea mud up for the rare earth minerals in it in a pretty large scale mining test.
This is the the kind of unspoken fourth type. Everyone likes to classify deep sea mining into
Mm.
nodules, massive sulfides, and crusts, and then now rare earth muds are going to be the kind of the fourth one on the list.
Yeah, so I think that test ends in mid-February, and hopefully after that we'll get a sense of how effective it was. I don't know if they're doing any environmental monitoring, but hopefully we'll also get a sense of, any ecosystem impacts from this new kind of mining, the deep sea.
Then, okay, what about the ISA? What are the plans for ISA in 2026?
Yeah, so there's a couple of ISA meetings coming up, one from late February into March and one from late June into July. With the ISA, they're famously boring and they're just making incremental progress toward regulations for commercial scale deep sea mining in international waters, which is good. Things should be slow and incremental and boring, probably, if they're happening responsibly. But there's also interesting discussions emerging about things like making regulations for sharing the benefits of mining in these international zones or protecting intangible cultural heritage for cultures that have the deep sea as part of their religion or ceremony or things like that. So it's worth following for sure.
Yeah, your next headline: implementation of the High Seas Treaty, BBNJ, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction.
So it has just gone into effect, and it's not directly related to deep sea mining, but a lot of questions remain about how it's going to mesh with the International Seabed Authority rules. I think the High Seas Treaty technically covers the waters, and the International Seabed Authority is in charge of the seabed. But for example, the High Seas Treaty creates a framework for creating marine protected areas in the open ocean. And so if a proposed protected area overlaps with a place where the ISA has issued mining exploration leases or plans to issue them, there's going to be a conflict that has to be figured out.
When I looked into this, my understanding was the ISA has already done a fair amount of the work that the High Seas Treaty is doing for marine minerals. Let me say that again. What the High Seas Treaty is doing is establishing marine protected areas and standards for environmental baseline studies that need to be done for other industries that affect the oceans beyond national jurisdiction. But these things were already done by the ISA. So, what I had imagined this was doing was essentially extending the kind of safeguards and regulations that the ISA has been working on for now 30 years, extending that into the rest of the open ocean beyond national jurisdiction.
Yeah, that's interesting because the ISA already has a framework for reserving protected zones of the seabed and things like that. And it can't do that for the water column, but the high seas treaty means that now that can happen for the water column. Yeah, there's a lot of really big questions about how this is going to play out in practice.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting. I mean, one of the things people in the deep sea mining conversation bring up is how much scrutiny deep sea mining gets compared to bottom trawling. When
Mm,
you see the comparison to the amount of seafloor that's anticipated to be affected by deep sea mining compared to how much gets affected by bottom trawling every year, it's
mhm.
like orders of magnitude different. And so one wrong doesn't justify another wrong, or one harm doesn't justify a smaller harm, but kind of the other way around. It'd be nice if this high seas treaty can rein in some of the damage that I think everybody agrees is coming from bottom trawling.
Yeah, deep sea mining is famously subjected to a lot of scrutiny before it has even begun. And that's maybe all extractive marine industry should actually have that high level of scrutiny. So it would be nice to see that.
Anything else before we get to the worst headline award?
I love doing the worst headline, but let's talk about what's coming up in the US just briefly. We have new streamlined permitting rules in place, and we have the impossible metals plans to mine around American Samoa, which are still being considered. There has also been a proposal for the US to open areas around the Northern Mariana Islands to deep sea mining. So, again, that's US waters, it's around a US territory. The Northern Mariana Islands are the northern part of the island chain that includes Guam. So, Guam's part of that conversation as well. And there's been a lot of local resistance to these proposals, in part because the proposals are for federal waters, so it's outside of the territorial waters where the people of the territory have a say in what happens there. And because it's in federal waters, not only do the territories have no say in whether deep sea mining happens, but they also would reap no benefits from mining unless companies voluntarily decide to give them benefits. So that's a big ongoing debate right now.
You learn so much about how much territory the U.S. owns beyond its borders when you find out all of the different Pacific islands that are becoming interesting for deep sea mining. So these Mariana and Guam interest, this is coming from BOEM. It's not being driven by any companies, as far as you understand.
Yeah, not that I'm aware of. BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which oversees activities in US waters, announced this opening around the Northern Mariana Islands in an area that really hasn't been well researched. It's near the Mariana Trench. As I understand it, it's a fairly complex area of seabed that would be really challenging to mine. And I hear that there's been some interest from companies, but I'm not convinced that the companies were really pushing for this opening. Maybe they were, and it was just happening in back channels. But I think it's odd that the US is proposing to open in this area that hasn't had a lot of research and a lot of interest.
On the note of complex seafloor, am I right in that the new regulations to the NOAA has changed their rules that they now differentiate between nodule mining and other types of seabed mining, and that the streamlined permits process is only for nodule mining?
Yeah, I think that was already in the rules. It was something that I was not aware of before, that the NOAA rules around deep sea mining are only applying to nodules. But that was something when they published this new streamlined permitting rule, that was highlighted in the language that they published, that this is only for nodules. This is not applying to seamount crusts or the hydrothermal vent deposits. So I think the US has rules that would allow it to mine those crusts and those seafloor massive sulfides, the vent deposits in its waters. But in terms of its international rules through which the US government can give permits for US mining in international waters, there are only rules that apply to polymetallic nodules. And that's not a new thing. It's just something that was news to me, and I think it's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. It makes a lot of sense. From what I understand, there's just so much more knowledge and baseline data on nodules.
Hmm.
And I think as Andrew Thaler said in his testimony to Congress recently, last week, he pointed out that the nodule ecosystems are much more relatively more uniform than the vent field. So they're going to require the vent. We should kind of stop saying vent fields because that gives people the impression that people are going to mine active hydrothermal vents. But
Hmm.
I think in the more complex undersea terrain, he pointed out that there's just going to be more variation between ecosystems there. And so those are going to just require more research and study comparatively to
Hmm.
the nodule field. So it makes sense that that NOAA would distinguish this.
Yeah, it's more technologically challenging and environmentally concerning to mine these seafloor massive sulfide areas or seamounts than it is to mine the polymetallic nodule fields. Not that there aren't also challenges and concerns there, but they just aren't quite as big.
Great.
Yeah. So I think that has covered everything except the worst headline.
Okay, go for it.
Scientists race to strip mine ocean floor treasure. Pacific contains 21 billion tons of metal nodules worth trillions while threatening 90% unknown species.
That's almost grammatically correct.
Almost. But there's an aggressive amount of numbers in this headline, and I'm also concerned by the opening claim that scientists race to strip mine ocean floor treasure. I don't think scientists are doing that.
Yeah, that's a broad use of the word scientist, certainly.
And you can't obviously hear this, but that first part, scientists race to strip mine ocean floor treasure, is in quotes, which implies that somebody said this. But in the article, there was no such quotation. So it seems like there's a bit of deliberate misleading happening here.
I guess this is the kind of thing that a journalist would pick up on. I do appreciate that there's a lot of information contained in this headline. You're right. It's numbers heavy. It's aggressively numerical, as you say. But I feel like if those numbers were right, I would learn a lot from the headline.
That's true. It could be reworked into a not worst headline. The potential is there.
I mean, what they're gesturing towards is that some number of species in any given mining area is currently unknown to science.
All of these numbers here are vague and hard to quantify, right? We don't know for sure how many tons of nodules are in the Pacific. We certainly don't know how much they're worth. Trillions is a very rough estimate. So I'm just wary of numbers in general that can't be backed up with hard evidence, and maybe that's because I'm a journalist.
What was the publication?
That was energyreporters.com. I don't know anything about
European Energy News is its
European Energy News.
subheadline.
Yeah. I mean, the actual article, as is often the case, was not as bad as the headline, and I think that's because a lot of times a writer makes a good faith effort to make a good article, and then an editor slaps a headline on it that might not align with the actual facts.
Poor Gabriel Cruz got his article poorly headlined.
It happens. It happens to all of us. It has happened to me.
Okay, I guess we can wrap that up and call it a news update for 2026. Elyse, thanks as always for taking the time to educate listeners and myself on what's going on in the deep sea mining world.
Thank you for having me.